Major General Anna Peterson sat alone in her Pentagon office long after the sun had gone down, her desk covered with stacks of reports and folders that never seemed to end. The weight of her single star on her uniform was heavy, not because of its physical form but because of the responsibility it represented, responsibility for the lives of thousands of soldiers and for decisions that could alter the security of her country. She had given more than 20 years of her life to military service, working her way up through the ranks with grit, sacrifice, and absolute loyalty to the flag. Her colleagues respected her as a strong, disciplined officer, a woman whose dedication never wavered no matter how challenging the mission. But beneath the polished medals, the sharp uniform, and the reputation of being unshakable, she carried a private pain, one that grew heavier with each passing month. On the corner of her desk stood a small framed photograph of her son, Paul Peterson. He was just 20 years old, bright-eyed, full of energy and dreams, and now serving as a private at Fort Jackson in South Carolina. The picture had been taken years earlier, back when he was still a boy with a mischievous grin, hugging his dog in the backyard of their modest home. Every time Anna's eyes landed on that picture, she felt the familiar ache in her chest. She had missed so much of his childhood birthdays, school plays, simple evenings at home because her duty always came first. She had been the mother who sent quick phone calls between deployments, the one who apologized for not being there, the one who promised she would make it up to him someday. And though Paul never once complained, Anna knew he must have felt the absence, the quiet loneliness of growing up with a mother who belonged more to the army than to him. Now he was a soldier himself, following in her footsteps, and 6 long months had already passed since he began his service. 6 months, and she had not once visited him properly, always pushing it aside with excuses of busy schedules and urgent meetings. The guilt gnawed at her relentlessly, whispering that she had failed him not as an officer, but as a mother. That night, as she stared at the glowing city lights of Washington through her office window, Anna Peterson made a decision. She would go see him. Not as Major General Peterson, but as Mom. She would leave behind the sharp creases of her uniform, the shining insignia, and the aura of command that surrounded her. She wanted to show up at Fort Jackson not as a symbol of authority but as a simple mother who loved her son. Determined, she drove home, went straight to her bedroom closet, and pushed aside her neatly hung uniforms until she found an old soft sweater and a pair of comfortable slacks. She held them up to herself in the mirror, doubting for a moment. Would Paul be embarrassed to see her dressed so plainly? Would the other soldiers judge him because of her? She caught herself smiling sadly. It was a strange fear, but she knew appearances mattered in the army. Still, she wanted Paul to feel the warmth of home, not the intimidation of a general's presence. The next morning, Anna woke up at dawn with a sense of purpose that she had not felt in a long time. She tied her hair back casually, set her uniform aside, and turned to the kitchen. For the first time in months, she cooked not for efficiency but for love. She pulled out pans, pots, and ingredients she had been saving, and she prepared all of Paul's favorite dishes: golden chicken cutlets crisp on the outside and tender within, creamy mashed potatoes with a touch of butter just the way he liked, a big bowl of classic potato salad, and even warm cabbage pies that she hadn't baked since he was a little boy running into the kitchen after school. She packed everything carefully into containers, wrapped them with care, and placed them in bags. As she worked, she murmured softly to herself, "Paul, Mom's bringing you lots of good things this time." Her voice cracked slightly, but her smile was genuine. When she finished, she loaded the bags into the trunk of her car, double-checking that nothing was forgotten, and then slid into the driver's seat. For once, the road trip wasn't about business or an official visit. The early spring sun cast a golden glow across the highway, the trees budding with new life, the radio playing cheerful tunes that carried her back to easier days. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of calm, as if she were just another mother going to see her child, not a decorated general burdened by national defense. Meanwhile, at Fort Jackson, Paul was counting the days until his mother's arrival. The long weeks of training, the constant drills, and the endless responsibilities had toughened him physically, but deep down he still missed the warmth of her presence, the taste of her cooking, and the comfort of her smile. To his fellow soldiers, he often spoke proudly of his mother. "She's incredible," he would say with shining eyes, though he never revealed her true rank or position. To Paul, she wasn't just a mother, she was his hero, the strongest person he knew. But he also longed for the simple side of her, the woman who used to tuck him in at night, who laughed with him, who hugged him tight when he was little. He imagined her walking through the gates with a smile and a bag of homemade food, and just thinking about it filled him with joy. And so, on that early morning, two hearts longed for the same thing, a reunion not between a general and a private, but between a mother and her son. Anna's car rolled steadily down the highway toward South Carolina, each mile bringing her closer to him. She rehearsed in her head how she would greet him, how she would try not to cry, how she would simply hold him for a while and tell him how proud she was. She didn't know that this visit, born of love and longing, would become the spark that would shake the very foundations of the army. She thought it would just be a quiet weekend with her boy. But destiny had something very different in store for Major General Anna Peterson. When Major General Anna Peterson arrived at Fort Jackson, she parked her car near the visitor's lot, adjusted the strap of the heavy bag filled with homemade food, and took a deep breath. The base looked as she remembered it from years ago when she was still climbing the ranks, a place of order and discipline, but also a place where young men and women grew from raw recruits into soldiers of the United States Army. She had walked these paths before, but this time it felt different. She was not here as a commander inspecting her troops, but as a mother coming to see her son. As she stepped into the family visitation building, she could feel her pulse quickening. The room was simple, rows of tables and chairs, a few posters on the walls about Army values, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights above. Other families were already there, greeting their loved ones with hugs, smiles, and laughter. Anna tightened her grip on the bag of food, her heart swelling with anticipation. She imagined Paul's face lighting up when he saw her, the way he would dive into the chicken cutlets and mashed potatoes she had made, the way his eyes would soften at the sight of something from home. But before she could find a seat, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp uniform intercepted her. His name tag read, Miller, Staff Sergeant John Miller. His expression was stern, almost sneering, as he glanced from her plain clothes to the bag she carried. "Ma'am," he said sharply, his tone devoid of warmth, "you can't bring that in here." Anna blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." Miller crossed his arms. "That bag. Food. Whatever's in it. Regulations don't allow this kind of junk. We have standards here. Soldiers eat Army rations, not whatever some lady cooks up at home." His words stung, not just because of their harshness, but because of the contempt dripping from every syllable. He looked her up and down as if she were out of place, as if she didn't belong in this room filled with families. Anna kept her voice calm, though her chest tightened. "This is for my son. I thought it would be allowed." Miller smirked. "Your son, huh? Figures. Let me guess, one of the kids who can't handle Army food and needs mommy to bail him out. What is this, fried chicken? Potato salad? Smells greasy. You think you're doing him a favor, but all you're doing is spoiling him." His words cut deeper than he realized. Anna clenched her jaw, forcing herself not to react. She had endured criticism before, from superiors, from politicians, from the media, but this was different. This was personal. He wasn't mocking a general, he was mocking a mother. She could see other families watching nervously, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Some lowered their eyes, uncomfortable with the scene. Miller stepped closer, lowering his voice but not his venom. "You know, people like you embarrass your kids. Coming in here with bags of homemade slop, looking like you just stepped out of a thrift store. These young soldiers need discipline, not coddling. Maybe you should think about that before you humiliate him in front of everyone." Anna's knuckles whitened as she held on to the bag. She wanted to snap back, to remind him of the values the Army stood for: respect, honor, integrity, but she bit her tongue. For Paul's sake. She didn't want to cause a scene that would make his life harder. She reminded herself she was here to comfort him, not to start a battle. At that very moment, the door opened and Paul walked in with a group of soldiers. His eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on her, his whole face lit up. "Mom," he exclaimed, hurrying toward her. His joy was so genuine, so pure, that it momentarily eased the sting of Miller's words. Anna's heart leaped at the sight of him, taller and stronger than when she had last seen him, yet still her boy. But as Paul reached her, Miller stepped between them like a barrier. "Private Peterson," Miller barked, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "is this your mother?" Paul froze, his eyes flicking nervously between his mother and his sergeant. "Yes, Staff Sergeant," he said cautiously. Miller gestured toward Anna with disdain. "She thinks it's appropriate to drag this junk food into a military facility. Do you think that reflects well on you as a soldier? Do you think this kind of behavior earns respect?" Paul's face reddened. He glanced at his mother, then back at Miller, torn between loyalty and fear of reprisal. "Sir, she just wanted silence, Private," Miller snapped. "This isn't about what she wanted. This is about you learning to stand on your own 2 feet instead of leaning on mommy's apron strings. You want to be a soldier? Then start acting like one. Tell her to take this trash back where it belongs." The room had gone silent. Families stared, soldiers shifted uncomfortably, and Anna felt her heart splinter. She had come here to bring joy, to give her son comfort, and instead she was being used as a weapon to shame him. She saw the pain in Paul's eyes, the way his jaw trembled as he struggled to respond. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to smile faintly at him, silently telling him not to worry, not to argue. She wouldn't let this escalate further, not here, not now. With quiet dignity, Anna nodded and said softly, "It's all right, Paul. Don't worry about it." Miller smirked triumphantly, as if he had won some invisible battle. He leaned close enough for only Anna to hear and muttered, "Next time, stay home, lady. Your kid doesn't need you embarrassing him here." The humiliation burned like fire in her chest. She wanted to unleash the authority of her rank, to strip him of his arrogance with a single sentence, "I am Major General Anna Peterson, and you will show respect," but she stayed silent. She wasn't here as a general. She was here as a mother. She swallowed the insult, forced herself to sit down at the table with Paul, and tried to create a normal moment despite the storm raging inside her. Paul leaned close, whispering, "Mom, I'm so sorry." He had no right. She touched his hand gently and whispered back, "Don't apologize, sweetheart. None of this is your fault." They ate quietly, sharing small smiles, pretending for his sake that everything was fine. But inside, Anna felt broken. Never in her life had she been treated with such contempt, not even by adversaries on the battlefield. This wasn't just disrespect, it was cruelty. And it was happening inside the very institution she had devoted her life to protect. As the visit came to an end and Paul was called back to duty, Anna hugged him tightly, whispering in his ear, "I'm proud of you. Don't forget that." He held her close, his voice choked with emotion. "I love you, Mom." She kissed his cheek, then turned and walked out of the visitation room with her head held high, though her heart felt shattered. The laughter and chatter of other families buzzed behind her, but all she could hear were Miller's cruel words echoing in her mind. By the time she reached her car, her hands were trembling so badly she could barely fit the key into the ignition. She sat there in the parking lot for several minutes, staring at the steering wheel, her eyes burning with tears. For the first time in years, Major General Anna Peterson cried not as a soldier, but as a mother who had just been humiliated in front of her son. She thought she had come here to give him comfort, but instead she had been made into a source of shame. And though she had endured the insult in silence, deep inside her something had shifted. This was not just about her. This was about a culture of cruelty, a sickness within the ranks that needed to be addressed. Miller's words might have been aimed at her, but they reflected a deeper rot. She wiped her tears, steadied her breathing, and gripped the steering wheel with renewed resolve. She would not let this stand. She would not allow arrogance and abuse to poison the very army she had sworn to serve. She would be silent no longer. The drive back from Fort Jackson to Washington felt longer than it ever had before, every mile dragging like an eternity as Major General Anna Peterson's mind replayed the scene over and over again. The image of Staff Sergeant John Miller sneering at her, belittling her son in front of everyone, mocking her home-cooked food, mocking her appearance, mocking her role as a mother cut deeper than any wound she had sustained in her long career. She had faced hostile interrogations from foreign officials, sat across the table from hardened generals in tense negotiations, and endured the cold gaze of politicians questioning her every decision, but nothing compared to the sting of being humiliated in front of her only son. She had gone there with love, with the simple human desire to hold him, to feed him something warm from her kitchen, to let him know that no matter how far she had risen in the army, she was still his mom. Instead, she had been ridiculed like an outsider, treated as if she were an embarrassment, a nuisance, someone unworthy of respect. The tears came freely on the dark stretch of highway, blurring her vision until she had to pull over at a rest stop, clutching the steering wheel as sobs racked her body. She hadn't cried like this in years. Not when she lost comrades overseas, not when she missed Christmas after Christmas at home, not even when her marriage had collapsed under the weight of endless deployments. But this humiliation was different. It struck at the very core of who she was. She wiped her face, drew a shaky breath, and told herself to calm down. A general did not lose composure, not even in solitude. But in that lonely car, under the fluorescent glow of a gas station light, she allowed herself to be just Anna, not Major General Peterson, and to feel every ounce of pain she had buried. She thought of Paul's face during the visit, the way he had tried to hide his discomfort, the way he whispered apologies as if any of this had been his fault. Her heart broke all over again. He didn't deserve to be put in that position. He didn't deserve to be shamed in front of his peers for something so innocent as a mother's love. And she realized something with startling clarity: this wasn't just about John Miller. This wasn't about one cruel sergeant flexing his authority. This was about a culture, a sickness that had taken root in places like Fort Jackson, where power was misused, where respect was demanded from subordinates but not given in return, where young soldiers were being hardened not through discipline and honor, but through humiliation and fear. Anna's tears dried into a simmering resolve. She would not, let this stand. By the time she pulled into her driveway in the quiet Washington suburb where she lived, it was nearly dawn. The sky was beginning to pale, the world waking up, but she felt drained and hollow. She went straight to her kitchen, dropped the untouched bag of food onto the counter, and stared at it. The chicken cutlets, the potato salad, the pies still perfectly good, still lovingly made, but now they felt like symbols of her failure. She sank into a chair, laid her head in her hands, and whispered into the silence, "What have I done? I just wanted to see my boy." Hours later, when the sun was high, she sat at her desk at home, the uniform jacket draped neatly over the back of the chair. She looked at her phone for a long time before finally picking it up and dialing a familiar number. The voice on the other end was warm, steady, and commanding all at once: General Susan O'Connor, her closest friend in the army, a woman she had trusted for over 20 years. "Anna," Susan greeted, a touch of surprise in her voice. "It's been a while. Everything all right?" At those words, Anna's composure cracked again. She hadn't planned to cry, but her voice wavered as she recounted the story in painful detail. She told Susan about the visit, about the cruel words Miller had spat at her, about how he had mocked Paul, about how helpless she had felt sitting there pretending everything was fine. She poured it all out, her shame, her anger, her sorrow. Susan listened quietly, not interrupting, not offering quick fixes, just letting Anna release what she had been holding in. When Anna finally finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then Susan spoke, her tone steady but laced with controlled fury. "Anna, this isn't just about you. This is systemic. What you experienced is happening in different forms all across the army. Power unchecked becomes abuse, and abuse erodes the very values we swore to uphold. Anna nodded even though Susan couldn't see her. "I know," she whispered. "But what do we do? If I act personally, it'll look like revenge. They'll say I pulled rank to settle a personal grudge." Susan's reply was immediate. "Then don't make it personal. Make it bigger. Launch an inquiry, a real one. Expose the culture that allows men like Miller to thrive. This isn't just about defending your honor, it's about protecting every young soldier out there who doesn't have a general for a mother." Anna's heart pounded. The thought of dragging this into the light was terrifying. It would mean political battles, resistance from the old guard, scrutiny from the media. It would mean exposing herself and her son to attention they hadn't asked for. But as she sat there, staring at the photo of Paul on her desk, she knew Susan was right. She couldn't let this rot continue unchecked. If she stayed silent, then Miller would go on humiliating others, and men like him would keep rising through the ranks. Her silence would make her complicit. Her voice, however, could make a difference. That night, Anna typed up a detailed report, documenting every word, every action, every humiliation. She didn't use her son's name, she didn't want him targeted, but she laid out the behavior, the culture she had witnessed, the danger it posed to morale and discipline. She cited past cases, complaints she had heard whispered over the years but never formally reported. She built a case, not just against Miller, but against the system that enabled him. By the time she finished, the sun was rising again. She read over the report one last time, her hands trembling slightly, then sent it to Susan and a small circle of trusted allies within the Department of Defense. She leaned back in her chair, exhausted but resolute. The decision was made. There would be no going back. She was no longer just a mother seeking dignity. She was a general fighting for the soul of the army. And as she closed her eyes, she prayed silently, "Paul, forgive me if this brings you more hardship before it gets better. But I promise you, this is for you. For every soldier who deserves respect. For every mother who sends her child into uniform and expects him to be treated with honor." Somewhere deep inside, the pain had transformed into something sharper, something stronger. It was no longer just grief. It was purpose. And Anna Peterson was a woman who had never failed when she had purpose. The shockwave hit Fort Jackson like a thunderclap on a clear day. It started quietly, whispers passing from barracks to mess halls, from junior officers to drill instructors. An inspection team from the Pentagon was on its way, and not the routine kind either. Everyone had seen inspections before, checklists, formalities, paperwork signed and filed away, but this was different. Rumors spread that it had come straight from the top, that someone high up in Washington had ordered it personally, and soon the base was buzzing with nervous speculation. Staff Sergeant John Miller heard the news while barking orders on the training field, his voice cutting through the morning air as he berated a line of recruits for the way they held their rifles. When one of his fellow sergeants jogged up and muttered about the incoming inspection team, Miller smirked, more amused than alarmed. "Let them come," he said dismissively. "I run a tight ship. They won't find a damn thing wrong here." But the smirk didn't last. That afternoon, a convoy of black SUVs rolled through the gates, and the men who stepped out weren't the usual inspectors. They were senior officers from the Department of Defense, accompanied by sharp-eyed investigators carrying folders, recorders, and the unmistakable air of people who weren't here for show. Their arrival sent a ripple of unease through the ranks. Soldiers straightened their uniforms, officers scrambled to make their units look sharp, and commanders rushed to review their paperwork. The atmosphere was tense, every man and woman on edge. Miller, however, maintained his swagger. He greeted the team with forced politeness, offering clipped answers to their questions, projecting the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. But when the first interview began, that confidence started to crack. The inspectors didn't ask about weapons maintenance or drill schedules. They asked about conduct, about how non-commissioned officers treated their subordinates, about whether there had been incidents of humiliation, disrespect, or abuse. At first, the soldiers they interviewed hesitated, glancing nervously at one another, fearful of repercussions. Miller had ruled his corner of the base with intimidation for months, and the fear lingered. But the inspectors were persistent, their questions precise, their tone protective rather than accusatory. And slowly, the stories began to spill out. A private recounted how Miller had mocked his accent in front of the entire platoon. Another described being forced to do push-ups in the mud until he nearly passed out because Miller didn't like the way he answered a question. A young female recruit told them about the constant belittling, the sarcastic comments designed to tear her down rather than build her up. The inspectors listened, documenting every word. When one soldier faltered, afraid to continue, the lead investigator leaned forward and said quietly, "You're safe here. No one will retaliate. Tell us the truth." And the truth poured out. By the end of the first day, the picture was clear: Miller wasn't a hard but fair leader, he was a bully. He thrived on humiliation, wielding authority not to shape better soldiers but to feed his own ego. His cruelty had left scars on those under his command, scars that might not show on the body but ran deep in the mind. Miller, sensing the shift in the air, grew defensive. He scoffed at the accusations, calling them exaggerations, whining about soft kids who couldn't handle discipline. But when the investigators produced evidencia recording from the visitation room, captured on the building's security cameras, his bravado faltered. There he was, in crisp high definition, sneering at Anna Peterson, belittling her in front of her son, mocking the food she had brought, calling her an embarrassment. The inspectors didn't reveal who she was, they simply played the footage and asked, "Is this you?" Miller stammered, trying to explain it away, claiming he was maintaining discipline, that the regulations were clear. But the sneer on the screen spoke louder than any excuse. It wasn't discipline. It was cruelty. Behind the scenes, whispers grew louder. Word spread quickly among the soldiers that the woman in the video wasn't just any visitor. She was a major general from the Pentagon, though she had come incognito. That revelation sent shockwaves through the base. Some soldiers felt vindicated, realizing their suffering under Miller might finally be recognized. Others trembled at the thought of how far-reaching the consequences might be. Miller himself felt the ground crumble beneath him. He had thought he was untouchable, that his stripes gave him power without accountability. Now he realized he had insulted not just a soldier's mother, but a general with allies in the highest corridors of power. For the first time, fear crept into his eyes. The inspection continued relentlessly for several days. Investigators pulled training records, reviewed complaint logs, and cross-checked everything with testimonies. They found patterns, complaints quietly buried, reports of misconduct ignored, young soldiers leaving the army early because of personal reasons that, under scrutiny, traced back to bullying and abuse. It was systemic negligence, and Miller was at the center of it. By the time the final day of inspection arrived, the evidence was overwhelming. Miller sat in a stark room across from the inspectors, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. His earlier bravado was gone. He shifted in his chair, fidgeted with his hands, tried to explain himself, but every word dug him deeper. When one investigator finally said, "Staff Sergeant Miller, your conduct is a disgrace to the uniform you wear," his face went pale. He tried one last desperate plea. "Listen, I didn't know who she was. If I'd known she was a general," but the lead officer cut him off sharply. "That's the point, Sergeant. Respect isn't about rank. It's about dignity. And you showed none." With that, the room fell silent. The writing was on the wall. Later that afternoon, the official announcement came down: Staff Sergeant John Miller was stripped of his rank, relieved of his duties, and reassigned to a disciplinary battalion pending further review. The news spread like wildfire, leaving the base stunned. For some, it was a moment of vindication, proof that justice could prevail. For others, it was a wake-up call that the old ways of bullying and humiliation were no longer acceptable. As for Anna Peterson, back in Washington, she received a discreet phone call from Susan O'Connor. "It's done," Susan said simply. Anna closed her eyes, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She didn't feel triumph, not really. What she felt was relief, and beneath that, a renewed determination. This wasn't just about one man's downfall. This was about changing the culture that allowed him to rise in the first place. And though she knew the fight was far from over, she also knew something important had shifted. The army had been forced to look at itself in the mirror, and the reflection wasn't flattering. But mirrors don't lie, and change begins with truth. At Fort Jackson, young soldiers walked a little taller, whispering to one another that maybe, just maybe, things were about to get better. And in the heart of it all, Paul Peterson trained harder than ever, carrying himself with quiet pride. He didn't know every detail of what had happened, but he knew this: his mother had stood up for what was right, not just for him, but for all of them. And that knowledge filled him with a strength no humiliation could ever take away. The interrogation room at Fort Jackson was suffocating with silence, the kind of silence that presses down heavier than words. Staff Sergeant John Miller sat across from the investigators, his hands twitching nervously against the steel table. Hours earlier he had still tried to carry himself with bravado, insisting the accusations were exaggerated, that he was just enforcing discipline, that recruits were soft these days. But that flimsy defense had collapsed the moment the inspectors rolled in a cart with files, printed complaints, and worst of all, a monitor that replayed the footage from the visitors' lounge. The screen showed every smirk, every sneer, every word of contempt he had unleashed on a woman who had carried nothing more than homemade food for her son. The inspectors didn't even need to say who she was. The humiliation was already written across Miller's paling face as he realized how ugly and indefensible his actions appeared to anyone watching. When one officer finally leaned forward and revealed the truth that the woman he had mocked, dismissed, and belittled was none other than Major General Anna Peterson from the Pentagon, it was as if the ground split open beneath him. Miller's mouth fell open, his excuses caught in his throat. He stammered about not knowing, about how if he had recognized her, he would never have spoken that way. But the lead investigator's voice cut through the air like a knife. That's exactly the problem, Sergeant. Respect is not reserved for stars on the shoulder. Every soldier, every parent, every human being deserves it. And you failed. The weight of those words seemed to crush Miller where he sat. He dropped his eyes to the floor, the sweat rolling down his temples, his hands now trembling so violently he had to clasp them together to hide it. The room brimmed with evidence, testimonies from privates who had suffered his cruelty, reports that had mysteriously vanished from official logs, video clips of training sessions where Miller's methods looked less like discipline and more like abuse. Each document, each testimony, was another nail in the coffin of his career. And then came the final blow, a stack of signed statements from recruits past and present, detailing months of harassment, mockery, and even outright threats. Some recounted how Miller had belittled their parents during visits, calling them weak or pathetic. Others described being forced to perform humiliating punishments for trivial mistakes. Reading the words aloud, the inspectors painted a damning picture not just of a man who had failed in leadership but of someone who had systematically poisoned the morale of his unit. Miller tried to defend himself once more, raising his voice, pounding the table with his fist. This is the army. It's not summer camp. These kids have to learn toughness or they won't survive out there. His voice cracked on the last words, betraying the fear creeping into him. The investigators remained unmoved. Toughness is forged through training, not humiliation, one replied calmly. And leadership means building strength, not tearing it down. You failed in that duty. Miller's shoulders slumped. The fight drained from him as the reality set in, there was no way out. Later that afternoon, he was escorted to a formal hearing held in the base's headquarters, with the commanding officers assembled alongside the Pentagon inspectors. The atmosphere was grave, every face tight with discipline. Major General Anna Peterson herself was present, sitting silently at the far end of the table, her uniform pristine, her star glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. She hadn't needed to be there, her influence alone had already set the investigation in motion, but she came, not as a mother seeking revenge, but as a leader demanding accountability. When Miller was brought in, his steps faltered at the sight of her. The arrogance he had once carried evaporated completely. He sank to his knees before her, his voice breaking as he begged for forgiveness. "General Peterson, I didn't know, I swear I didn't know who you were, please forgive me just this once," he cried, his forehead nearly touching the floor. But Anna's face remained unreadable, her voice steady, cold yet dignified. "Sergeant Miller, yesterday I was not here as a general. I was here as a mother. And the way you treated me is the way you have treated countless others' parents, soldiers, your own subordinates. You brought shame not to me, but to the uniform you wear. Respect is not earned by stripes or demanded through fear. It is commanded through honor. And you have dishonored not just yourself, but the army as a whole." Her words struck harder than any punishment, the weight of truth impossible to ignore. Miller wept openly, his broad shoulders shaking, his once proud figure now pitifully small before the weight of the room. Yet Anna did not soften. "This is not about me accepting your apology," she continued. "This is about the Army's responsibility to every soldier and every family who entrust their children to serve. Your punishment will be decided not by my forgiveness but by the law you have broken and the code you have betrayed." The decision was swift. Stripped of rank, Miller was removed from his position, reassigned to a disciplinary battalion pending court-martial. His name and record of misconduct were logged into the Army system, circulated across all commands as an example of what happens when authority is abused. The announcement reverberated throughout Fort Jackson like a thunderclap. For years, Miller had been feared, his presence a shadow over the lives of young recruits. Now that shadow had been lifted. In the barracks, whispers of relief mingled with cautious hope. Soldiers who had once endured in silence felt a new confidence, emboldened by the knowledge that someone powerful had seen their suffering and acted. Some called Anna Peterson a savior, others simply referred to her with newfound reverence. For Paul Peterson, the impact was deeply personal. Watching from the sidelines, he saw his mother not just as the woman who had raised him but as a force of justice, a leader who had turned private pain into a catalyst for change. The pride that swelled in him was indescribable, mixed with guilt for not defending her that day, and determination to live up to her example. Across Washington, the repercussions spread quickly. The Pentagon issued directives for comprehensive reviews of unit cultures nationwide. Inspectors were ordered to dig deeper, not just into logistics and drills but into the moral fabric of leadership. New channels were established for soldiers to report abuse without fear of retaliation. Training for officers and NCOs was revised to emphasize not only discipline but also respect, empathy, and accountability. The incident at Fort Jackson became more than a scandal, it was a turning point. The story circulated through the ranks, told in hushed tones during chow, repeated with awe in barracks late at night, the tale of the staff sergeant who mocked the wrong woman, who turned out to be a general, and how that moment of arrogance toppled his entire career. But beneath the humor lay a serious lesson: leadership without honor is nothing, and cruelty has no place in the uniform. Miller's fall became a symbol, a cautionary tale etched into the Army's culture. And for Anna Peterson, it was never about vengeance. Sitting in her office back in Washington, she reflected quietly. The punishment of one man was only the beginning. What mattered was the larger reform it had sparked, the ripple effect reaching soldiers she might never meet, parents she might never know, but whose children deserved dignity. The victory wasn't in Miller's tears or his disgrace, it was in the hope that no other mother would sit in a visitor's room and endure what she had endured. It was in the knowledge that justice, once awakened, could not easily be silenced. The aftermath of Staff Sergeant John Miller's downfall rippled far beyond Fort Jackson, stretching into every corner of the U.S. Army and reaching deep into the Pentagon's marble halls where policy was forged and futures were decided. The scandal had been too public, too undeniable to sweep quietly under the rug. A staff sergeant mocking a mother in front of her son would have been bad enough, but the revelation that the woman was Major General Anna Peterson turned it into a reckoning. Newspapers caught wind of the story, though the Army never officially released Anna's name. Whispers from enlisted men spread like wildfire until journalists pieced together the truth. Headlines blared across the country, painting Miller as the face of toxic leadership and raising uncomfortable questions about the Army's culture. Veterans called into radio shows, recounting their own stories of humiliation at the hands of petty tyrants in uniform. Parents of recruits wrote letters demanding reform, and members of Congress always eager to look tough on military accountability seized the chance to hold hearings. What began as a local disciplinary issue became a national debate. Was the Army producing warriors, or was it breeding bullies? Inside the Pentagon, Anna Peterson found herself at the center of the storm, though she had never sought the spotlight. She sat in meetings with generals and civilian leaders, her voice steady as she explained the deeper problem. This isn't about one sergeant, she told them. It's about a culture that tolerates behavior like his until it festers. We can't just punish individuals, we need systemic change. Her words carried weight not only because of her rank but because of the moral authority she now embodied. She wasn't speaking as a detached officer, she was speaking as a mother who had lived the problem firsthand. Slowly but surely, initiatives took shape. A new program was launched under the banner, Respect and Resilience, aimed at reshaping the way non-commissioned officers were trained. Drill instructors and staff sergeants would undergo mandatory courses in leadership ethics, learning to balance discipline with humanity. Whistleblower protections were strengthened, giving recruits and junior soldiers safe channels to report abuse without fear of retaliation. A hotline was established, manned not by officers but by independent ombudsmen who reported directly to the Inspector General. At Fort Jackson, the changes were immediate and visible. Training sessions were revised to emphasize not just physical toughness but mental resilience. Recruits were taught how to withstand stress without being stripped of dignity. Drill sergeants who had once relied on fear found themselves held to higher standards, their evaluations now including anonymous feedback from recruits. Some resisted, grumbling that the Army was going soft, but the tide was turning. Younger leaders, inspired by the scandal, embraced the reforms. They saw firsthand how fear bred resentment while respect bred loyalty. For Paul Peterson, the transformation was personal. Once timid and hesitant under Miller's harsh gaze, he now flourished in an environment that valued strength without cruelty. His confidence grew, his skills sharpened, and his peers began to look up to him not just as a soldier but as a natural leader. One evening, during a leadership exercise, his platoon sergeant asked who inspired him most. Paul answered without hesitation, "My mom. She showed me that real strength isn't about tearing people down, it's about lifting them up." The word spread quietly through the barracks, and soon, Paul's reputation carried the weight of his mother's legacy. Beyond the base, the ripple effect widened. At Fort Benning, Fort Hood, and bases overseas, inspection teams conducted surprise evaluations, rooting out toxic leaders before they could do lasting harm. Old complaints were reopened, and forgotten cases were re-examined. Some officers were relieved of duty, others received retraining, and in every case, the message was clear: the era of unchecked abuse was ending. It wasn't easy. Resistance came from entrenched leaders who saw the reforms as an attack on tradition. They argued that the Army had always been hard, that toughness came from suffering, that recruits had to be broken down to be built up. But Anna Peterson countered that breaking someone was not the same as forging steel. Discipline doesn't require humiliation, she said in one particularly heated meeting. Courage isn't born from fear. Our soldiers deserve leaders who embody honor, not cruelty. Her words resonated, especially among younger officers who had quietly longed for change. And slowly, the old guard began to give way. Congress took notice of the progress. Funding was allocated to expand leadership development programs, mental health resources for recruits, and family support services. For the first time in decades, military culture was under the microscope not just for its combat readiness but for its humanity. Families noticed the difference too. Visiting days at training camps no longer carried the same dread. Parents were welcomed warmly, treated with respect, recognized as partners in their children's service rather than as nuisances. Anna often received letters from mothers and fathers she had never met, thanking her for what she had done. Some simply wrote, "You gave us our voice back." She kept those letters in a drawer in her office, each one a reminder of why the fight mattered. Yet Anna herself remained humble, refusing to see the movement as hers alone. "This isn't about me," she told Susan O'Connor one evening as they walked past the Pentagon's reflecting pool. "It's about the Army living up to its own values. It's about making sure every soldier, from private to general, remembers that respect is the foundation of strength." Susan smiled knowingly. "Still," she said, "sometimes it takes one person's courage to remind the rest of us what those values mean." In the months that followed, the Army's reputation began to recover, not because it hid its flaws but because it confronted them. Stories appeared in the press about reforms, highlighting the voices of young recruits who felt empowered to speak without fear. Veterans who had once scoffed at the idea of change began to admit that maybe the new approach was better, that maybe the Army was finally learning that true toughness came from unity, not division. For Paul, the journey was still unfolding. He graduated from basic training with honors, his head held high, his mother watching proudly from the stands. When his name was called, he didn't just march forward as a soldier, he marched forward as living proof of change. His fellow recruits cheered louder for him than anyone else, not because he was the strongest or the fastest, but because he represented hope. And in that moment, Anna felt tears sting her eyes. She had worn the uniform for decades, served her country in ways few ever saw, but nothing compared to watching her son step into his future with dignity intact. That night, as the sun set over the parade grounds, she stood alone for a moment, gazing at the flag rippling in the wind. The battle against one man's cruelty was over, but the fight for the soul of the Army continued. Yet she felt something she hadn't in a long time, hope. Hope that the next generation of leaders would be better, wiser, and more compassionate. Hope that respect had finally taken root where arrogance once thrived. And hope that her son, and countless others like him, would grow not under the shadow of fear but under the light of honor. Years later, the echoes of that fateful day at Fort Jackson still reverberated across the Army and within the Peterson family, shaping legacies in ways none of them could have imagined when it all began with a simple visit from a mother to her son. John Miller's name had long since faded from the headlines, remembered only as a cautionary tale in leadership courses and whispered warnings among new drill instructors who were reminded of what arrogance and cruelty could cost. He was discharged after his court-martial, stripped of his rank and dignity, left to rebuild a civilian life in anonymity. For many, he was forgotten, but for those who had lived under his shadow, his downfall remained a symbolic victory, proof that accountability was possible even in an institution known for protecting its own. For Anna Peterson, however, it was never about Miller himself, it was about the movement that followed. In the years after the reforms, she watched as the Army slowly but steadily transformed. Reports of abuse declined, channels for complaints functioned with real authority, and families felt safer entrusting their sons and daughters to military service. Her name became associated not only with her rank but with her role in reshaping the culture, though she never sought such recognition. She always said the true heroes were the young soldiers who had the courage to speak out, and the families who had refused to stay silent. Yet her legacy was undeniable. Military academies began teaching the Peterson Principle, a framework of leadership ethics centered on respect, empathy, and honor. Cadets studied case files from the Fort Jackson scandal as examples of how quickly leadership could rot when respect was lost, and how one moment of cruelty could spark a firestorm of change. The Peterson Principle became more than a guideline, it became a cultural shift, a reminder that the Army's strength depended not on fear but on mutual trust. Paul Peterson grew into that new culture, carrying the lessons of his mother's ordeal with him through every stage of his own military career. He rose through the ranks not as the fastest or the strongest but as the one his peers turned to in moments of doubt. He earned a reputation for being tough yet fair, demanding yet compassionate. Soldiers under his command often said they felt they could talk to him, that he listened, that he never used his authority to belittle but to build. His name carried a kind of reverence, not because of his mother's position, but because of his own earned respect. One night, years into his service, Paul found himself leading a platoon during a grueling training exercise in the mountains of Colorado. Exhausted recruits stumbled through snow and wind, morale sinking. Instead of barking insults, Paul stopped them, gathered them around a small fire, and told them the story of a mother who once brought food to her son, only to be mocked and humiliated. He told them how that moment sparked a change that reshaped the army. He didn't reveal the woman was his mother, not at first, but he saw the way the story lit something in their eyes. Later, when one recruit asked if the general in the story was really his mother, Paul simply smiled and said, "It doesn't matter who she was. What matters is what she stood for." His recruits finished the exercise stronger, bonded not by fear but by shared purpose. Back in Washington, Anna eventually retired, her decades of service leaving behind a legacy carved not just in medals and promotions but in the very fabric of the institution. On her last day in uniform, she stood in front of a crowd of officers, soldiers, and families, her son at her side. In her farewell speech, she didn't talk about battles fought overseas or strategies drawn in conference rooms. Instead, she talked about dignity. "When we put on this uniform," she said, her voice steady though her heart swelled with emotion, "we don't just carry the flag on our shoulders. We carry the trust of every family who sends their child to serve. That trust is sacred. It can be strengthened with respect or shattered with cruelty. Never forget that." The room erupted in applause, but Anna's eyes found Paul's, and in that moment, the pride they shared was beyond words. After retirement, she devoted herself to advocacy, speaking to young leaders, writing about leadership ethics, mentoring officers across branches of the military. Her message remained the same: respect is the foundation of strength. She became a sought-after speaker at universities and think tanks, her story resonating far beyond the army. Parents, teachers, even corporate leaders found lessons in her words. She had lived through humiliation, turned it into a catalyst, and transformed it into hope. For Paul, her example continued to guide him. He built a family of his own, raising his children on the values his mother had instilled in him. Sometimes, when his own son asked why respect mattered so much, Paul would pause, remembering that day in the visitors' lounge, the shame he had felt, the quiet strength his mother had shown. He would tell his son, because one moment of disrespect can break someone, but one moment of respect can change the world. And his son listened, wide-eyed, carrying those words as a torch for his own future. Years passed, generations shifted, and yet the Peterson legacy endured. Soldiers who had once trained under Paul rose to become leaders themselves, passing on the values of honor and dignity. Families entering the army felt reassured knowing that the institution had learned from its past, that it had faced its flaws and chosen to grow stronger by embracing respect. And though the story of John Miller faded into the footnotes of history, the story of Anna and Paul Peterson became a quiet legend, story not of vengeance, but of justice, resilience, and the belief that true power lies in treating others with dignity. On quiet evenings, Anna would sit on her porch overlooking the rolling Virginia hills, sipping coffee as the sun dipped below the horizon. She no longer wore the uniform, but she didn't need those values it represented lived on in her son, in her grandchildren, in the countless soldiers she had inspired. She would smile softly, thinking of how far they had come, and whisper to herself, "Respect is the real strength." And with that, the legacy was complete, not a tale of one woman or one family, but a story woven into the very soul of the army, ensuring that no soldier, no mother, no family would ever again endure the kind of humiliation that once threatened to break them, but instead would stand taller, prouder, united by the simple, unshakable truth that honor begins with respect.